Excellent. Thank you, Colleen, for inviting me to do this. So today we have the text, transmission, and date of Bede's uersus de die Judici. And what I'd like to do is try and convince you of 4 points today. The conclusion of the poem, the conclusion of Bede's Judgment Day poem, has an address to Acca, and I'd like you to believe that it had 7 rather than 8 lines. A contemporary, probably Aldhelm, removed one of these, rewrote the following one, and made several verbal substitutions earlier on in the address. Late in the Anglo-Saxon period, a second reviser, perhaps Birkfirth, combined the 2 earlier versions. And 4th point, Bede wrote the poem in 700 to celebrate Acca's ordination to the priesthood. So we have some work to do, but I think all of those are fairly factual. What I'm also have on the screen right at the moment and had on the opening slide is the frontispiece of a 12th century German manuscript now at Harvard. It's Bede's commentary on Luke. And this image appears here and only in this manuscript as far as I know. What interests me, in addition to these 4 very factual points, is that there's so much more to say about this poem because of the close relationship between Bede and Acca. I'm going to try and stay away from that in today's paper, but it's fascinating. It's a really fascinating topic. So, what I'm sure you've already noticed is that there's a poem over top of Bede's head in this manuscript, and it begins, Ad laudem Christi, non nulla pater voluisti, per me conscribi. And it goes on for another couple of lines. It's absolutely fascinating, so lots more to do. But what we have to work with here today, the end of Bede's Judgment Day poem, is fascinating in its own right. So here we have a manuscript that you all know well, Cambridge Corpus Christi College 139. This is Birkfirth's part of the Historia Regum. And he includes Bede's Judgment Day poem. And here's how it ends in his version. So if you come down 4 lines, you see a line written in. I'm not going to talk about that now, but we could during questions if you'd like to. And then another line, and then the address begins, in columem. And we'll run for 8 lines down to meque, right over the historiated, the enlarged H, 3/4 of the way down. This is the text that was published in 1652 by Sir Roger Twisden. So it's the one that most scholars have in the back of their minds. And indeed, this is the text that Lappage publishes, or at least is influenced by in his edition. Because you'll see Acca pater, trepidi et pavidi, remeniscere, and then what Lappage publishes is servi. Now, that reading occurs here and only here. This is the only manuscript with that reading. It's the one that Lappage favors, I think because it's the one that he knows and expects. But notice in this manuscript it has a gloss on it, well, werna. And this, I think, is going to be key to the interpretation, the evidence that I'm going to present to you today. Acca pater trepidi et pavidi remeniscere werna is the line that Aldhelm removed. But let's get into it with Lappage's text, and then his translation, but then down at the bottom, the 4 manuscripts in which this appears, with the readings of that last word of line 7 in Lappage's text, berna, werna, werna, and berwa. That, I think that's berna with a misunderstanding of the minims. I think that explains that reading. But let's start with the translation. Dear brother, let Christ protect you safely for me, and may he always make you blessed without end. Look, following your requests, I have sung these songs of weeping for you. You keep your promises, I beseech you, made with trustworthy speech, now commending me, the poet, in your prayers to Christ. Live blessedly in God and give my regards to the good brothers, Father Aka, and remember your fearful and trembling servant, and commend me to Christ in your kindly prayers. Now, even just reading it aloud, I think you've probably noticed that there's some repetition here, which shows up even more clearly when we stay with Lappage's text. So look at line 5, commendans. Look at line 8, commenda. And then 3 more words that are in different metrical positions. So it's not a Fante's borrowing, but that's an awful lot of repetition for a poet to make in such a short space. And I think it's the first evidence that we have that what we're dealing with here in this version is a revision of Bede's original. So let's flip to what I think Bede's original is. Again, found in 4 manuscripts. The Cambridge Trinity College manuscript has this part in a later hand, so it's less good evidence, but Lappage groups it with the other 4 in his stemma. But this is, I'm going to argue, Bede's original. In columem mihi te Christus, carissime paster, protegat, et faciat semper sine fine beatum, en tua iusa sequens, scripsi tibi carmina luctus, tu tua fac promissa precor, sermone fideli aca pater, trepidi et pavidi reminiscere verna, meque tuis Christo precibus commenda benignis, vive Deo Felix, et diquale fratribus almis. Now, it's very different, isn't it? Because it ends with such a different final line. That last line changes the tone of the whole poem. We'll keep thinking about it, but it reads fine, doesn't it? And in fact, I think it's better than the one on number 1, the one that Lappage publishes, the one that's in the Birkfirth version of the whole thing. But I think we can see it more clearly. I think we can see what happens more clearly if we look at the 3rd version of this address. Again, found in 5 manuscripts this time, but it's really interesting. It's the exact same as number 1 up until the 5th, no, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines, and then the 6th line appears in a different place. Let me correct that. The first 6 lines, forgive me, are identical with the first 6 lines of number 1. Mistake on my part. What obviously could explain that is that the person copying number 3 simply had a text which had lost the last 2 lines. That would be a perfectly reasonable explanation if we didn't also have to figure out how 2 was related both to 1 and to 3. So let's take a minute to do that. Look at, think in line, or in the first version there, go to that 5th line, commendans praecibus Christo, modo meque canentem. And then go to the final 2 lines, aca pater, trepidi et those 2 lines. It's beyond belief to me that someone writing that would write the 5th line and then restate essentially the same idea in the final line, but have the 7th and 8th line capable of being substituted in where line 5 was, with no other grammatical changes. You'd think if you were the poet writing it, you'd say, oh, wouldn't it be cool to have those last 2 lines moved up 1? That would solve it. But the poet didn't, according to Lappage. This is Bede's original version. Now, notice that that's not what happens in 2. In 2, that substitution takes place, but the 5th line of 1 is removed. And look at the slight differences in meaning between those. So tu tua promissa, or tu tua fac promissa, excuse me, keep your promises. That's a fairly strong thing to say to someone, keep your promises, right? But it's explained in the second version because we then get what those promises are. Remember, Aka Father, your fearful and trembling servant, and commend me to Christ with your prayers. So the plural promises gets moved out into 2 things, 2 other commands that he's asking that Aka remember. In number 1, keep your promises, remembering, or commending me to Christ. Clearly, 2's the better reading. 2 is the one that was originally written by Bede because the ideas make more sense there. That's our first indication. But then, second indication, how would you get, if 2 is the original, how would you get from 2 to 3? And I think what you can see is, so be in 2 for just a minute. So keep your promises made with faithful words, made in a sort of honest and faithful way. But then the next line gets removed, Aka pater trepidi. That's the line that someone drops. Alt helm, but let's not get there quite yet. Someone drops that line. And then try and follow it with meque tuis Christo precibus. So keep your promises. That becomes even stronger if what we get is a participle, gerund participle, beginning the next line just saying, remembering me in. The promises, we don't get too, that's the earlier argument, but it makes that statement even stronger. So what's happened is that after dropping Aka pater, the reviser of number 3 gets rid of or has to revise the line that begins meque tuis praecibus. And that's what then is going to give us number 3, ending with the same line as number 2. 3 can't be our original. It's got to come from either 1 or 2, and there are good explanations for both. But 2 is superior to 1, and so likely to be what Bede wrote, likely to be Bede's own text. Now, if you still don't absolutely believe that, let me give you one other reason to. Go up to the first line, the last word of the first line in 1 and 2, the frater and the pastor, which is the lexio difficilior. It's clearly pastor. But in this case, it's also the perfect word in an address to Aka by Bede, because Faith Wallace has told us that David was another name that Bede and his circle of friends, those fratribus almis, used to refer to Aka. We can go into that in the discussion if anybody doesn't know Faith's argument, but it's brilliant, it's absolutely brilliant, and this supports her understanding of that, because David was among the sheep when Samuel showed up to anoint him king of Israel. He is the pastor, right, with all of the typological implications of that obviously Raz and Scatta Gregorio have laid out so beautifully in their translation of that commentary. This becomes even clearer if you'll give me half a second with the source. The source for the line is clearly Paulinus of Nola's poem for Licentius. Michael says CF here, and I think it's because He's nervous about the lack of other evidence for Paulinus's letters in Anglo-Saxon England. But obviously, Paulinus sent a copy of this not only to Licentius, but also to his good friend Augustine. And it must have been included in the collection of Augustine's letters that Bede knew. Look at the last word of the Paulinus poem, Christus, the anointed, the pastor, the good shepherd, all of the sort of implications of this. This is the perfect way to address Aka Pater Pastor on the day that he's ordained a priest. Not bishop yet, but priest. And so that puts the poem in 700. Now, I think I could probably say enough, that I've proven the 4 main points that I want, but there's still that alt-helm problem sort of lurking in the back of your minds. And there's the question of why would someone remove line 5 of Bede's original? Why would alt-helm, if I'm going to blame alt-helm, why would alt-helm have done it? And it gets us to another manuscript. This is the Saint-Omer manuscript of the poem, not particularly important because it's a later manuscript. They're all important. Every manuscript's important. But what this one is really important for is the gloss over Berna. That is a well-born heir, a Berna. The slave word, werna, spelled with a B, somehow can be explained as a well-born heir. I thought, that's a scribe who doesn't know this spelling or perhaps even doesn't know the word, which is going to give us vernacular, by the way. It's not the spring word, obviously, but the home language that we all use. I thought it was a desperate effort on the part of a scribe to make sense out of a word that he didn't know. But then, reading a little bit further, I ran across Martyrius's work on the confusion of the B sound and the W or the V sound. He writes 4 chapters on this, which Cassiodorus picks up in their entirety and repeats them entirely in his work on orthography. It's clear that Bede knew that work, that it was there in Monkwearmouth Jarrow. And so it's the source, actually, I think, of what Bede is doing at the end of that line. The passage itself is incredible. It specifically identifies Berna as the right spelling of Werna, because, and to find this in a work of orthography is just mind-blowing to me, because Martyrius has heard of another Greek friend being corrected, this Greek friend who was a judge in all matters of eloquence, being censored by a learned Roman for pronouncing it with the letter V. An Oxonian correcting somebody in stores for their bad Latin pronunciation. Do you know what I mean? It's just great to see it written out, isn't it? And you can imagine Bede, reading this work and just suddenly thinking, oh my word, they argued about this kind of stuff. This is fascinating. But the explanation that he comes up with Martyrius comes up with, is finally that Berna is associated with bona, someone born into inherited wealth. And that explains why it should be written with a B. Does that make sense? Well, not from a modern perspective. Isidore would have liked it, but not from a modern perspective. And what's interesting to me is apparently not from the perspective of the monks of Monkwearmouth Jarrow, because in copying out the Codex Amiatinus, they carefully preserved all of those was or was, probably was, I'm assuming a classical pronunciation here, as they copied out their text of the Bible where the word appears 5 or 6 times, I've forgotten the exact number. And if you turn to Bede's own works, he talks about the vernal equinox, that spring equinox all the time. But in the few times that he also uses werna, or words related to it. He spells it in the manuscripts and in the text that, well, in the text that I've seen, and certainly in the manuscripts I've been able to check, Bede opts for a w or a v spelling of Werna too. So not in use at Monk Wearmouth Jarrow, but who did use it? And of course you know the answer, it's Aldhelm. And here he is in his work on metrics, talking specifically about Berna and saying that it's common to all three genders, so he clearly has read Martyrius and Cassiodorus too, but he comes down on the side of the Berna. It should be written with a B. And indeed, Aldhelm goes further. He styles himself the Bernaculus Christi. Bede was the Famulus Christi, but he may have been influenced, and still thinking about this earlier moment, when Aldhelm styled himself as the Bernaculus Christi. My claim, and you can see why it gets deeply personal at this point, and why I'd like to be able to focus on what the simplest explanation for the textual transmission is in the paper that I'd like to write for Colleen. But my explanation of this is that Aldhelm felt as though he were the butt of a joke going around at Wearmouth Jarrow. So when he got his hands on this poem, he excised the line, rewrote the next one, and then used his scriptorium to disseminate copies of his text of the ending, hoping that that would be the one that was preserved. And he almost did. I mean, it's preserved in as many as Bede's own original is. So I hope I've done it for today. I hope I've proven these four main points: 7-line address, Aldhelm gets rid of one, somebody late in the Anglo-Saxon period, and that's likely to be somebody like Byrhtferth, somebody in the Benedictine Reform who wants to preserve everything Bede wrote. And then finally, that Bede wrote it around 700, but certainly at the time that Acca became pastor. Acca was Christus. Acca was David and anointed. Some facts here, but obviously lots more to do. The fourth line of the poem is scribere, nempe, libet, namque, vacare, piget. Lots of work still to do, but I hope, Colleen, you'll help me to carve out a paper that I can publish with you. Delighted to be here. Many thanks. And now, Colleen, the extra slides that I could use during question and answer. Here, the manuscripts listed out. The 7-line address to Acca, Bede's 7-line address appears in these manuscripts, and here's some more details on them. Aldhelm's 6-line revision appears in these. Byrhtferth's 8-line revision appears in these. We get the dates of them. But there are a couple more things that are kind of interesting too. The question of the transmission of the text as a whole. Michael assumes that the text was sent to Germany where it got truncated, the address got cut off. That line 155 that we saw all the way up at the beginning in the Byrhtferth version of it, that's the inserted line there, but inserted at the wrong point. And then somehow comes back to England and gets the address put on in the 8-line version, and then is further disseminated back onto the continent. It doesn't make sense. It makes so much more sense to say that this is a text that was almost immediately revised. There were 2 versions sent out from England in the 8th century, and then finally various versions, at a place like Ramsey, late in the Anglo-Saxon period, had the various versions and combined them at that point. But what I've done here is I've gone back to the key line for Michael in establishing the proper reading, and it's his line 25. And the reading that he eventually adopts is kalamos. He thinks that's the better reading than animos, which is the other version. So I went back and checked it in the Rylands Library, which is a version of Bede's address, and sure enough, animos is the reading in the Bede version. And if you go, this is the Leiden manuscript, as you well know better than I do. Sure enough, here what it has is, this is Aldhelm's address, a text with Aldhelm's address, but it's got the inferior reading here, the non-Bede reading. So again, I think Michael's just got it backwards. I think this is Aldhelm correcting rather than Bede's original. And then just for the sake of comparison, I went back to Cambridge Corpus Christi College 139, right, the Birktvirth. And there it's kind of cool because it's animos with the gloss over top, further evidence of somebody combining individual things. Those are the slides that I have in case there are questions. I just want you guys to be aware of them. Thank you.